make my
I hear
toes
say
grow up that much.
I have to wait till sundown to take it to the hospital.
Okay. Baruch atah Yahweh Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'shmoah kol shofar. Blessed are you, Yahweh Eloheinu, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and commanded us to hear and respond to the call of the shofar. All right.
Get those long quick
Somebody younger had a lot more wind.
Yeah, it's right there.
Why is he sitting there?
Father, as we come before you this day, on your Shabbat, we ask that you guide us through your word. Give us the wisdom and the understanding that you want us to have from your word. Know each one of us and what we need. Touch us with that which we need to have in order to move on in your word, walking in your word in our life. Guide us into all truth, Father. B'Shem Yehoshua. Amen.
Amen.
And the readings today, and today, by the way, is Shabbat Shuvah. And we'll find out here in a minute what Shuvah is. It actually means to repent and turn back. Not to the very beginning, because none of us can go all the way back to the very beginning. But we turn back where we are, and we start from this point and go forward, walking in obedience to his word. And the readings today, we're going to be in Deuteronomy chapter 21, starting in verse 10. And we'll be reading through chapter 25 and verse 19. The Haftarah is kind of we've already done what they call a Haftarah in Isaiah. So actually today, what I'm going to be doing is, in connection with Shabbat Shuvah, we're going to start in Hosea 14, chapter 14, starting in verse 2 through 10, and then we're going to go on through a whole bunch of stuff that I got planned. We're going to actually talk about Galatians 3:29. Okay? So, and we'll see where that goes from that. But the first thing we're going to read right now, does anybody know what it is?
Psalm 27.
Psalm 27. And this is just in case y'all didn't get it last time. Okay? And while everybody's turning over to this psalm, you realize this is a psalm of David in Psalm 27. And the name David is the number 1732. If you haven't got it, written down, you might want to look it up. The word comes from the number 1730, and the Hebrew word is dod. Dod.
What is the number again?
1732 comes from 1730. In a way, literally it means to boil. In a figurative sense, the word means to love, as in the beloved. By implication, the name means a love token. Anybody have thought of that? David was given as a love token. He was given as a symbol. He was given as a type, a shadow, a picture of the Mashiach. Anybody have thought about that? The word also means an uncle. As in a blood relative. And in verse 1 of Psalm 27, it says, a psalm of David. And then he says, Yahweh is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Remember the word salvation, there should be the word deliverance. So Yahweh is my light and my deliverance. Whom shall I fear? If we have made Yahweh our light, and if he is our deliverance, then what in the world have we got to fear? If you haven't made him your light, And if you haven't made him your deliverance, then you got a lot to be afraid of. And then it says, Yahweh is the strength of my life. The word strength is the number 4581. It's the word ma'oz. The figurative sense of the word means a defense. You know, army, you know, anybody ever play chess, right? The best defense in chess is a strong offense. Anybody ever realize that this Bible, this word is called our what? Our sword? You know, a sword is an offensive weapon. A shield is a defensive weapon. We don't call this a shield. We call it our sword. He is our shield. He is our defense, right? And that's what David's talking about. He is his shield. He is his defense. The Magen David is the shield or the defense of David. And who is that? Yahweh. He is my defense. Yahweh is the defense of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? If Yahweh is defending me, who is there to be afraid of? Verse 2, when the wicked came against me to eat up or to devour my flesh, my enemies and foes, they stumbled and fell. Though an army should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this I will be confident. And what is the this? Referring back to verse 1. Yahweh is my light and my deliverance. That's who can I fear? That's his shield. In verse 4 he says, one thing, actually the word thing is not in there, but one thing I have desired of Yahweh, and he said, that will I seek. Notice what he is seeking for, and then the question is, are we seeking for the same thing? And remember, the scripture says that David was a man after his own heart. One I have desired of Yahweh, and he said, that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of Yahweh all the days of my life. Word house there is 1004. Beit. It means a house, but it also means a family. Has anybody ever thought about it, that we are dwelling in the family of Yahweh right now the minute we come to him? Now I know some of the other members of the family we don't always care for. We don't always like them, and they don't always do right, okay? But I mean, nobody can be as perfect as us, right? That I may dwell in the house of Yahweh all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of Yahweh, and to inquire in his temple. For in the time of trouble, it's kind of like referring to the time of the tribulation, isn't it? He shall hide me in his pavilion. That's why that first day of the 7th month is called Yom HaKesed, the day of hiding. He shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret place of his tabernacle, he shall hide me. He shall set me high upon a rock. We're going to be hidden on a rock. And who is the rock? Messiah Yahushua. In verse 6, and now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. Therefore I will offer sacrifices of joy in his tabernacle. I will sing, yes, I will sing praises to Yahweh. And now he's speaking directly to Yahweh. He says, hear, Yahweh, when I cry with my voice. Have mercy also upon me and answer me. You said, seek my face. My heart said to you, your face, Yahweh, I will seek. Remember, the word that's translated face means presence. So you're seeking the presence of Yahweh. He's always present in his word. He wrote the word, and then this word became flesh. You know what it says over in the Gospel of John? Though the word became flesh. The word is the Father. The Father became the Son. So when he stood up in the Gospel of John, he said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Who is he? What commandments do we keep? The ones he gave us, the ones he wrote with his finger on the stones. Verse 9, he said, do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. You have been my help. Do not leave me nor forsake me. Elohim of my deliverance. The El, or the creator of my deliverance. When my father and my mother forsake me, then Yahweh will take care of me. Teach me your way, Yahweh, and lead me in a smooth path because of my enemies. Do not deliver me to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and such as breathe out violence. And then the implication in verse 13, I would have lost heart unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of Yahweh in the land of the living. Verse 14, wait on Yahweh. Be of good courage. You know, you have to have courage, right? You have to have courage to stand in there. And if you don't see the goodness in the next 5 minutes, just wait. Because it's coming, because he said so, if you believe his word. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on Yahweh. That's a beautiful psalm, isn't it? Well, let's go back to Deuteronomy in chapter 21, and we're going to get into the Torah for today. After all, that's why we're here, right? In verse 10, actually starting last week in this chapter 21, we started a lot of the instructions that he was giving the people as they were coming into the promised land and getting ready to live. And here we have a continuation. Verse 10, he said, when you go out to war against your enemies, and Yahweh Eloheka delivers them into your hand. You might ever notice that? When you go out to war and Yahweh delivers them into your hand, does that mean that he's going to deliver them over so you can kill them? That's what he says, isn't it? We always get so afraid that, well, we're going to have to do it ourselves. And he didn't say, no, go out there and do it all by yourself and then come tell me what happened. He said, when you go to war, and he's going to go before us, is he not? When you go out to war against your enemies, and Yahweh Eloheka delivers them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and desire her, and would take her for your wife, then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and trim her nails. She shall put off the clothes of her captivity, remain in your house, and mourn her father and her mother a full month. After that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. He never said that you can't take a woman from that, that place. But at the same time, later on we'll find out that if that woman wants to maintain her false gods or her false heritage of wherever she came from, then she's no longer, what you thought she was going to be. We read these words and we have to look at all the depth of understanding and meaning behind them. You just can't take things on the surface, because we can build all kind of pictures on surface things. And in verse 14, it shall be, if you have no delight in her, then you shall set her free, but you certainly shall not sell her for money. You shall not treat her brutally, because you have humbled her. That word humbled is the number 6031 in the concordance, if you want to look it up. It can mean brutally, as in she were brutal, or forced her into something. Or it can mean to submit to, as in, a woman submitted to the husband in marriage and matrimony and so forth. But you don't, if you treated her this way, you don't pile insult on top of insult, is what this verse is talking about. The humanity of what Yahweh has for his people to treat other people with, whether they're enemies or not, you still use humanity to treat them, right? You don't treat them like they're scum of the earth. And I know we sometimes think about that. Every time we ever look at something and we use the term trailer trash, that's what we're talking, that's the way we're thinking about those people. Even when we use that term. Right? You can't, as long as you continue to think that way, then the words are going to come out of our mouth. We have to learn to change how we think. Because you never can tell how Yahweh sees that person, or those people, right? Remember I said this a long time ago, if we treat everybody like we're talking to the Messiah himself, then it changes how we treat people and how we think about people, who we are. It changes our relationship with people. And when we do that, then it forces them to have the same relationship back, whether we realize it or not. In verse 15, if a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and they have borne him children, the loved and the unloved, and if the firstborn son is of her who is unloved, before we go on, this is not saying that you should go out and get a second wife. It's just saying if you do. Okay? In the very beginning, how many wives did he make for Adam? One. Okay. And the word firstborn there in verse 15 is the number 1060. It's a Hebrew word bikor. It's where we get the term bikurim, or the law of bikurim, or the law of the firstborn. Remember, the firstborn son of the family is the one who has the right of the firstborn and what belongs to that person. Okay? But what he's trying to say here, that if you have two wives and you love one and you don't love the other. Isn't that exactly what happened between Rachel and Leah? But he said that the firstborn son, excuse me?
1060 was that number?
1060. So in the firstborn there, 1060 in verse 15, and then in verse 16 it says, then it shall be on the day he bequeaths his possessions to his son. To bequeath is like when a person dies and you leave them an inheritance. You know, bequeath. He must not bestow the firstborn status on the son of the loved wife in preference to the son of the unloved, who is truly the firstborn. Verse 17, but he shall acknowledge the son of the unloved wife as the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. And that word beginning there is 7225. Reshit. Where do we see that word? In Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning. In the Reshit. In the firstborn. In the beginning of his strength. And it's a reference to the Messiah Yehoshua. In him everything was created. I don't know how many people have ever really looked up those words and seen that they're the same thing. And go back and look at him. And how much does the scripture talk about firstborn? It's all over the place. In verse 18, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son. Yeah, I remember reading this passage one time. We had a couple that had come, you know, and this young man was there for the first time, and he'd never really heard anything about Torah. And everything was over after that day, and somebody asked him, did he learn anything? He said, yeah. You better behave yourself or people will kill you with rocks. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city. This is not talking about a 6 or 7 or 8 year old child. We know that. It's talking about someone who's old enough to know better, old enough to do things what they're supposed to do. In verse 20, and they shall say to the elders of his city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. That word glutton is a number 2151. It's the Hebrew word zalal. Glutton. We think of the term gluttony, we think of anybody who overeats or anything, The definition of the word means to be vile in the Hebrew, to be vile, wicked, evil, to be loose morally, to not have any kind of scruples about anything. They don't care what they do, It also means worthless, and it means wasteful. And then the word drunkard, the number is 5435 in the Hebrew. And the word there is sobeh. The phrase here is or thus sobeh, and sobeh. That word drunkard, it means a drinker of wine, but it also means one who drinks hard. Does anybody, understand? I mean, you might have a little drink every now and then, or drink something, but this is somebody who drinks hard. I mean, it's, put it in, give me a glass, give me 2 bottles, This is a noisy drinker, much reveling, loud, and also, some people when they drink, they get loud and they get, extremely loud and boisterous. But notice there, in verse 21, then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away the evil. Most Bibles have the word person in that verse there, the evil person. But if you'll notice the word person is in italics, which means it's not in the original Hebrew text. The translators put the word person in there because they think that you're trying to get rid of the person. And that's not the purpose of the whole thing. You kill that person because you're trying to eliminate the evil from the camp. And if you don't get rid of the evil, then it goes to the next one. Do you realize how many times that people, this is talking about being a drunkard and drinking and all this kind of stuff, not just murder or rape or anything. We don't even kill people for murder or rape anymore. Put them in jail, feed them for 400 years or whatever it is. But if they were killed, that evil would be destroyed, and the next person might stop and think, well, I don't want that evil, because they really don't want the punishment. But we don't have people that think that way today, not in our society. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones, so you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. Verse 22, if a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree. Notice carefully what that says. It says you don't take a man out there and hang them till they're dead. It says if you put to death and you hang him on a tree. The killing took place first. Then he was hung up on a tree for all to see. They didn't hang him on something and wait till he died. They killed him and then hung him up on a tree or on the pole, on a gallows, okay? I don't know if people ever really noticed that. That's what it says. The word hang is the number 8518. It's a Hebrew word tolah. It means to suspend, especially to gibbet. To gibbet. Gibbet. G-I-B-B-E-T. To gibbet. And that means to hang them by chains from a cross beam on exhibition. You remember how some of the old-timey things, in Old English and so forth, they had the stocks out in the middle of the square, and if somebody did something wrong, they put them in them things and put the board down around their head and their arms and everything and put them out there, and left them for 2 or 3 days or whatever. Can you imagine what that'd be like? I mean, your back would be hurting after a while, wouldn't it? But the hanging after death is to be an example to others, right? To bring fear and to induce obedience. Yahweh doesn't want to punish anybody. He wants people to be obedient, right? Go back to Genesis chapter 40. I'm not sure people remember that we had 40 chapters in Genesis. You remember this was the prayer, not the prayer, but the dream that one of the bakers had, to Joseph when he was in prison, and he gave him his dream. And he interpreted his dream here, and he said, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. He's going to lift your head off. I mean, he's going to cut off your head. Now, after his head was cut off, would you say he's dead? And then they're going to hang him on a tree, and while he's hanging on the tree, then the birds are going to eat his flesh. But he was killed first and then hung up. I don't know if we've ever really got a hold of that. Because our society said, we got to hang him by the neck until dead. When they cut this guy's head off, he didn't have no neck to hang him by. Now, go back to Deuteronomy there. In verse 23. His body shall not remain overnight on the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which Yahweh Eloheka is giving you as an inheritance, for he who is hanged is accursed of Elohim. I want us to get something real clear here. Remove and bury the body. It shall not remain on the tree overnight, to prevent the defilement of the land. A dead body is a primary source of making unclean. Remember how we go through it? If we touch a dead body or if we're in a room, we become unclean and we have to bathe and wash and be unclean until evening and so forth. So death makes unclean, and here he's saying that the land's going to be defiled by this thing. If the body begins to decompose, which is corruption, right? Then the impurity spreads far and wide, And this is the main source of various plagues. If you go back in history and look at all the plagues that occurred in the world, bubonic plague and all those kind of things were carried by rats and fleas and all this kind of stuff. And it was the filth and the uncleanness that everybody had which caused this mass spreading of all these germs and viruses and so forth. But here's, they're cursed of Elohim. Go to the Gospel of John in chapter 19. John 19. Now, we all understand that most of what we call New Testament scriptures are copies, you know, from Greek text, and there's a lot of different, they're all different, you know, and trying to make up something. But in this chapter 19 and in verse 31, it's talking about when Messiah died on the execution stake, and he said, "It is finished," and he bowed his head and died, right? Then verse 31 says, "Therefore, because it was a preparation that the body should not remain on the cross or the execution stake on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Yehudi asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away." Haven't we always had the understanding that, well, you can't leave a body hanging on the execution stake on the Sabbath? Based on what this says, right? But in Torah, why was the reason for not leaving the body on there overnight? To defile the land. Had nothing to do with whether it was the Sabbath or not. Now, I'm just trying to say that it's so easy to get a misunderstanding in your mind from skimming over some little verse, you know, and thinking, well, that's what it said. And who knows what the person wrote that wrote it, he might have thought that. But if we don't filter everything back through the Torah, then we get a misunderstanding. Where in Torah does it say that the body's not supposed to be on the execution stake on Sabbath? Doesn't say that, does it? Just says that it won't be hung up there, what, overnight. I just point that out so that as we read, as we study, we need to make sure that we read the words very carefully, read them 3 or 4 times, go over them, and ask ourselves what this is really saying. A cursory glimpse of Scripture won't give you what you need. Okay, go back to Deuteronomy. Notice in that verse 23, "His body shall not remain overnight on the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which Yahweh Eloheka is giving you as an inheritance, for he who is hanged is cursed of Elohim." Now he had become cursed, right? If you'll notice in Galatians, they always talk about, you know, he became a curse for us, right? That's true, but doesn't it say that anybody who's hung on the tree becomes cursed? The cursing in what we become is because of our disobedience to the Word. And when he got hung on the execution stake, he took the curse that comes to us so that we don't have to die. We can confess our sin to him, and he is faithful to forgive, and then we don't have to die, right? That eternal death. Chapter 22. "You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray." Do y'all realize how fast we went through that chapter? It's only been about 28 minutes I was keeping track.
Setting a record.
Setting a record. "You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray, and hide yourself from them," or ignore. That word hide there really means ignore. "And ignore yourself from them. You shall certainly bring them back to your brother. And if your brother is not near you, or if you do not know him, then you shall bring it to your own house, and it shall remain with you until your brother seeks it. Then you shall restore it to him." Y'all ever thought about how hard it is to know you got a brother and not know him? But have you ever thought about if we're all in the same family of Yahweh, and there are other groups around the world someplace in the same family of Yahweh, we have other brothers and sisters somewhere that we don't know. And one day we hope to meet them. But that's what this is talking about. When the tribes of Israel were camping around the tabernacle, there was, what, 2 million people out there. And it's very possible that you went your whole life and never met the guy living in the middle tent on the other side. Right? Wasn't 2 miles away, but, you know, you never got there. In verse 3, you shall do the same with his donkey, and so shall you do with his garment. With any lost thing of your brother's which he has lost and you have found, you shall do likewise. You must not hide yourself or ignore. You remember the old thing that we heard when we were growing up, finders keepers? That's a lie. It belongs to whoever lost it. Even the penny laying on the parking lot ain't yours. Verse 4, you shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fall down along the road and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him lift up again. Is this not talking about common decency in dealing with people? This happens to be within the family. But we have a duty to restore or to protect that which belongs to our brother. Go to Exodus chapter 2. All my pages get stuck together. In Exodus chapter 2 and in verse 4 and 5. In this passage, it's where Moses, and Pharaoh had already issued the decree, that all the men, children, had to be put in the river to be offered up to the Nile god. They had to be killed, right? And of course, how many people were doing it? Think about it, we only have one story here of one person that was saved in an ark, and all the rest of them were being killed by being thrown in the river. And Pharaoh was probably saying, offer them up to the Nile god, right? All the gods will get them. But here in verse 4, actually in verse 3, but when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Now we know from the movie that she followed the baby, right? But notice, his sister stood afar off, verse 5. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. Her sister, or his sister, was watching and doing all this, and we know what took place. But wasn't she there to try to protect? They wasn't about to let that baby die. They wasn't about to let that baby go the way of all the others, okay? Somebody cared enough to make sure. And then who actually gave him the name Moses? Pharaoh's daughter did. And what does it mean? To be drawn out or drawn out. And the one who was drawn out became the one who draws the rest of us out. And today we get drawn out of the world and follow Moshe because Moshe said, come out. Because Yahweh said to Moses, go tell them. What are we supposed to come out of? The world. It's the same thing. Same thing happening. But notice, in brother or enemy, we have a duty to restore and to protect. Brother or enemy, doesn't matter. What they do, what they think, what they feel, what they say has no bearing on how you react in any situation. How we react is our choice. We can choose to walk in obedience to what the Torah says, or we can choose to be affected by what the rest of the world thinks. And what does Yahweh think about what the rest of the world thinks? What did he say? All the nations of the world are like a drop in a bucket. Don't mean nothing. Go to Romans chapter 12. Now, in this particular commentary here in the book of Romans written by Paul, he is giving the people, have you ever stopped and think about Paul was called to do a certain thing, right? And he was called by the Mashiach to go out and reach people, and he was taught to say, and he told Paul a long time ago, I'm going to show you all the things that you're going to have to suffer for my sake. Does anybody realize how much Paul suffered? And yet he chose to keep on doing what Yahweh told him to do. You reckon people went around and tried to change him for what he was doing? Tried to get him to do something else? Well, I got a different word than you got, you know. And Paul, you need to be saying this or you need to be doing that. But he continued on in what he felt like Yahweh spoke to him to do. Are you supposed to live your life based on what somebody else thinks? Maybe y'all are all supposed to do what I tell you to do. Okay. You're supposed to do what Yahweh said to do. Is that true? And in order to know that, you have to read it and study it. That's what Paul learned what the Torah meant when he met the Mashiach on the road to Damascus, right? Because he saw the light. And what does it say in Isaiah? Anybody who doesn't speak according to this law, it's because there's no light in them. I think that's kind of interesting. But in verse 18, Paul writes, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, and now he's quoting, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says Yahweh. If we try to take vengeance on somebody for something that they did, aren't we trying to set ourselves up in the position of being God over him? Verse 20 says, therefore, if your enemy hungers, feed him. If he thirsts, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. You see, on your part, Yahweh is being glorified. If the enemy continues to be evil, then Yahweh is being blasphemed. And Yahweh will take vengeance. Have you ever thought about what he can do to somebody? I mean, he can make them like they never existed, right? In verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. You realize that's an instruction. We have the ability to do that. He's not going to tell you to do something you can't do. Overcome evil with good. That's a choice that we have to make. And we have the ability to do it. Go back to Deuteronomy. In verse 5, as we get into these verses here, we all know that there's been a lot of doctrines and teachings and everything else established on these words. And it's hard when we read these words to remember that these weren't written last year. These words are not written in our society. It's not written for what America thinks. It's not written for what Europe thinks. It's not written for what fashion people think. Okay? This is written for Yahweh to establish his rules and regulations between men and women and his people and what they're supposed to do. In verse 5, a woman shall not wear anything that pertains to a man, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all who do so are an abomination to Yahweh Eloheka. Now the question is, what today is a man's garment and a woman's garment? And what was it 3,500 years ago? 3,500 years ago, they all kind of wore the same thing, didn't they? Robes. How many of them wore pants? Don't think anybody did until he told the priesthood to start making pants to wear under their robes, you know, right? But as things change and as things develop, he's not telling you exactly what type of clothes, but it's obvious today whether a person is trying to wear women's clothes or if a woman's trying to wear men's clothes or whatever it is, they make this desire. And what do we call this? The practice of dressing in clothes of the opposite sex. It's a form of sexual perversion and it's known as transvestism. Transvestite is somebody who tries to convert to one or the other and they go through operations and all this kind of stuff to try to become something that they're not. And then we have a whole society of people today telling them, well, you can go get a sex change operation because you were really a man, but you were born a woman, but you were supposed to be the other. Or people decide they want to do that. Is that like a duck decides they want to be a chicken? Or maybe a dog wants to be a giraffe? I mean, isn't that what we're saying, that he made mistakes? Did he make any mistakes? No, he didn't make mistakes. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. This is important because And the thing about it is, our children, especially in public schools and out, in movies and everything else, what are they seeing? They're seeing what the world thinks is the right way to live. And what is the world calling these things now as that happens? Alternate lifestyles. Right? What do you mean alternate lifestyle? What is this? I mean, where did that come from? Isn't that the same thing as calling bad good? I mean, that's exactly what they're saying, okay? But in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1 says, imitate me as I also imitate the Mashiach. That's what he's saying to do. Verse 2, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions as I delivered them to you. That word tradition there means the Jewish traditionary customs and rules and regulations. They've been passed down. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Mashiach, the head of the woman is man, and the head of the Mashiach is Yahweh. Every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. I don't know if people ever thought about it or not, but a man today in a Christian church, he goes into church and takes off his hat. A Jewish man goes into synagogue and puts on a kippah. Did anybody ever notice something different about that? You know, in the Marine Corps, you're taught when you go in the Marine Corps that you have to remove your hat, out of respect, if you go to church or any place else or an enclosed building, you have to take off your hat. You can't have anything on your head. What's that based on? A misunderstanding of these scriptures. The only thing I'm trying to say is we have things built into our society today in American culture that people have known about and do and everything else without ever understanding what or where it came from or why. If you were to try to go against what those regulations say in the military and try to obey the Bible, what's going to happen? You're going to be in big trouble, Can you imagine being in a stockade just because you wouldn't, take off or put on a hat, one or the other? But those are not going to happen. If we come on down in verse 5, but every woman who prays or prophesying with her head covered dishonors her head, for that is one the same as if her head were shaved.
Read again.
Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one the same as if her head were shaved. But it's talking about the hair, is it not? So the whole thing is talking about one wearing hair, one not wearing hair, or something like that. What is this man then that's going to be covered? What I'm trying to get at, that phrase in verse 4, every man praying or prophesying hanging down over his head, is talking about men who have hair like women, and they're trying to look like women. They're trying to act like women. That's what this passage is all about. And if you look in the actual Greek text, the Greek text doesn't say having the head covered. The Greek text says hanging down over the head. All of it's about whether or not somebody's trying to act or look like a man or a woman, one or the other than what they are. And yet we have doctrine, tradition, we have groups running. Did you know that there's Messianic groups running right now? If you don't put on a kippah, they won't let you in. Or if you don't have, if a woman doesn't have long hair, they won't let her in. Or all kinds of rules and regulations based on misinterpretation of English words, which are a misinterpretation and translation from the original Greek anyway. And nobody ever bothers to go back and find out what it really says. But when you get through all of this fussing and everything, you go down to verse 16 of this chapter. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the called out ones of Yahweh. If we go back into the Torah, if we go back into Genesis and Exodus, okay, we find that the women there who had on veils and had their head covered, wearing all this kind of stuff, what were they doing? Most of the time they were prostitutes. So today they're trying to get everybody to dress like the prostitutes used to. Is that what it is? I'm just asking questions here because if we study these things out and compare these scriptures, then they should give us a new understanding. Okay. Before we leave that Corinthians in verse 17, we already leave? Now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better but for the worse. But first of all, when you come together as a group, or an ecclesia, or a called out group, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized or be made manifest among you. There must be factions. I think some, talks about heresies and everything. It talks about people following traditions of men. There's going to be a lot of people out there bringing in traditions of men, and how do you know whether they're traditions of men or whether they are the word of Yahweh? By studying the word. That's what tells you what the difference is. You can't go through life basing your life on what somebody else thinks. And I'm not trying to be facetious, but when you're trying to talk to people about Bible now and they say, well, I think, or I feel, or well, I just believe, who cares? But I understand how hard that statement is. But until you get the same decision, you can't always just, not hurt somebody's feelings. If them continuing to believe that's going to bring them death, what are you going to do? You've got to give them the truth, right? And if you don't, sometimes, and when you go away, if you didn't give them the truth, then they think, well, they believe it also. They believe it the same way I do. If somebody comes in here trying to teach some kind of a false doctrine or something that I don't agree with, I can't let it go by unchallenged. Because if I do, then everybody else begin to think, well, I believe the same thing, and I can't let that happen. Especially if I think it's wrong. But anyway, we'll get into Scripture later on that. Okay, go back to Deuteronomy. But notice in that verse 5, a woman wearing anything pertaining to a man, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment. It's not just the men or the women, it's both. All who do so are an abomination to Yahweh Eloheka. And verse 6, this particular verse 6 here is the commandment that in the Talmud they say is the least commandment of all. The least commandment of all. If a bird's nest happens to be before you along the way, at any tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, with the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. If you take the mother and the eggs or the babies and just, eat them all, then they're wiped out totally, right? If you take the mother, then what happens to the babies? They're going to die anyway. Verse 7, you shall surely let the mother go and take the young for yourself, that it may be well with you and you may prolong your days. Notice this is one of those commandments that has a promise of long life associated with doing what it said do. And it's associated with life. And it continues in the propagation of life, which is what Yahweh intended in the first place. How can people say this is the least of all the commandments? If it preserves life. Has you ever noticed how society changes things around and they put their understanding on something, whether it's true or not? What does Messiah actually say about which commandment is most important? Doesn't he say if you broke one, you broke them all? But he says the greatest of all is what? Shema. Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheka, Yahweh Echad. Hear, O Israel. Yahweh. Yahweh is one. He says that's the most important. Because if you don't believe he is one, then you just follow all kinds of stuff. In verse 8, when you build a new house, then you shall make a parapet for your roof. Back then they made houses with flat roofs. And a parapet means a fence or a rail around the roof of the house so people can't fall off. Because a lot of times people, slip up on the roof. When you build a new house, then you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring blood guiltiness on your house if anyone falls from it. Does that mean you're responsible for the life of the people that come into your house? You're responsible for the people that are there, right? And you're supposed to do everything you can to make it as safe as possible for them. Is that not, In verse 9, you shall not sow your vineyard with different kinds of seed, lest the yield of the seed which you have sown and the fruit of your vineyard be defiled. Different seeds. You can't plant, wheat and barley or different kinds of grains out in the field, because they'll cross-pollinate and they don't tell you what you'll get. You'll lose the purity of whatever it is. And yet today our society has tried to change everything. We change all kinds of seeds. We make hybrids. We make all this kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, the things that we're planting and growing today ain't nothing like they were originally. And how many of them have the same nutrition that they used to have? The land's not protected, so I mean, they're not getting the things that we need, right? Y'all ever stop to think about how hard it is to eat healthy? I mean, we all read labels, right? If you read very many labels, you'll realize real quick you ain't eating healthy. I don't care what you think. In verse 10, you shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. Anybody ever notice how much bigger an ox is than a donkey? One of them stronger than the other. I get this impression in my mind, and here's the ox plowing and the donkey hanging on the other end of the bow, and he ain't even touching the ground. You don't mix these things. Unequally yoked, if that's what they, would you call them unequally yoked? Go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Second Corinthians chapter 6. You remember Paul, and I forget now where it is in Scripture, but he was talking about when he finally went up to Jerusalem and they gave him the right hand of fellowship and he became partners with him, All of us are trying to teach the truth of the Word whenever we're talking to somebody, right? But what if you're partnered with somebody who believes something different from you? Then you're trying to get people to go one way and they're trying to get them to go somewhere else, and what's happening? Then it's an unequal type thing there, and you really couldn't ever make any headway because you're trying to push one way and they're trying to push another way, and things don't work right. Here in verse 14, he writes to us, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. What is an unbeliever? Somebody who doesn't believe the word of Yahweh. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? Now, if you look at fellowship as being partners, right? Then what partnership does a righteous person have with a sinner? What is it? Is there any? There can't any good come out of that. And what communion has light with darkness? Remember, the word communion just means a sharing. To have communion, it means to share. So what sharing has light with darkness? You go into a room at night and it's totally dark and you flip the switch and the light comes on, where'd the darkness go? It's gone. How can you have darkness and light at the same time? The only way you can is if you dim the light, right? When you dim the light, and the dimmer the light gets, well then the greater the darkness is, right? Now all of a sudden you get the light so dim you can't see anything in it. Have you ever noticed sometimes in a room that you may have objects in a room, some of them may be blue or green or red or what have you, but if you dim the light, get it down dim enough, you eventually reach a point where you can't tell what color it is. You know it's there and you know what color it's supposed to be, but you can't see it because there's not enough light to see it. Light is what helps us to identify things. The only way we can identify truth is through the light of what? What this word says. You try to throw some other kind of artificial light in there and it's not going to show up the same truth, the same colors. Has anybody ever bought something in a store and then took it home and said, boy, it's a different color here than it was when I bought it? Or if you buy it in the store and take it outside in the sunlight, what happens? I mean, I don't think we've ever really associated that, but when you buy something in the store and it's one way and you take it outside and look at it another, in the same way with Yahweh's Word. You go try to look at things aside from what His Word says and you have a totally different picture or light or color, something from what He says. If you want the truth, then you have to look at it in His light. This is what He's saying. What communion has light with darkness? And what accord has the Messiah with Belial? Or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of Yahweh with idols? For you are the temple of the living Yahweh, as Yahweh has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. If He's going to be your Elohim, you have to do what He said do. If He's not, then you don't. Then your Elohim, your Creator, your God, happens to be what? Something or somebody else. And generally because we follow what we want because we all have that bent towards, selfishness. Then we become our own God, right? It's a tough thought. Okay. Go back to 22. In verse 11. Well, I was looking at this last night, and in most English Bibles, we have the verse that says, "You shall not wear a garment of different sorts, such as wool and linen mixed together." Most Bibles have those words "such as" in there, right? But if you'll notice that they're in there, they're in italics, which means they're not in the original text. So if you take those out, then the actual text says, "You shall not wear a garment of different sorts, wool and linen mixed together." And those words, a garment of different sorts, is one Hebrew word. The number for it is 8162. And the Hebrew word there is the word sha'atnez. Or, if we translate it in English, it becomes linsey-woolsey. Now there may be some of you here that remembers, like I do, back in the old days when we used to have the Mott's 5 and dime stores. And you could go into the Mott's 5 and dime, and generally if you go all the way to the back on the right hand side, they had all that place back there for clothes hanging up there, and they had a special section up there that had a sign over it that said linsey-woolsey. And these were clothes that were made out of linen and wool, carded and mixed together, which is exactly what he says you're not supposed to wear. But if somebody's teaching, well, all that old law is done away with, we can do whatever we want to, so then they go do that, right? Because, made money with it. But that's what that is, sha'atnez, or linsey-woolsey. And I think most everybody's heard me say this before, to card fabric together means that you take fabric, and they got those brushes with the metal needles on them, and you put your block of cotton or something in there, and then you begin to brush these things together, and it stretches them out into long fibers. And then you can take those fibers and go to the spinning wheel and spin them and make a single fiber out of those fibers. When you mix those fibers together, the linen and the wool together, since one is animal fiber and one is, they're going to have different strengths. But even then he said don't do it. Did he say you can't have nylon and cotton or polyester and cotton? He didn't have that. He said you don't mix linen and wool because there are specific references to those two factors in the scripture. Verse 12, "You shall make tassels on the four corners of the clothing with which you cover." Most Bibles have the word yourself in there. That's not in there either. The implication is you're covering yourself. In verse 12, that word tassel, the number is 1434. And it's the Hebrew word gedalim. It means twisted threads. It means a festoon, festoon. We all know what festoons are. They're the fancy things hanging off of curtains and, lampshades and stuff like that, that they decorate with. It also means fringe. It literally means an ornament of twisted thread ending in loose threads, from the Hebrew. One of the main reasons that they used to make garments, and when they would weave them, it's kind of like we have on the prayer shawls that people weave and wear today. You can see these fibers running crosswise, and then these fibers are the ones that run in the length of the cloth. And if you leave these hanging down and tie a knot in them, then you can actually inspect them to find out one could be linen and one could be wool, or you can actually see what they are. And you can see the difference between the two. And then they would tie this, and this became a fringe. Now when he says you shall make a tassel, which means that you put a festoon to the fringe, so the tassel, and if we look over numbers, then you put what? The blue thread. They didn't say make them like that. This is tradition. But the blue thread can be added into this fringe. This is a way of doing that, not the only way. I want everybody to understand, we put a blue thread to the fringe. This is one way of doing it. There are other ways it can be done. Okay. In verse 13, now we're talking about marriage and so forth. "If any man takes a wife and goes into her and detests her." and charges her with shameful conduct and brings a bad name on her and says, I took this woman, when I came to her I found she was not a virgin. Then the father and the mother of the young woman shall take and bring out the evidence of the young woman's virginity to the elders of the city at the gate. The one thing that I'd like the people to think about as we read these scriptures, talking about the virginity of the woman, was it important in ancient Hebrew thought for a woman to be a virgin? Did anybody ever understand the reason why? Because the Messiah was going to be born of a virgin. So the desire of every woman then was to be the one that he chose to give birth to the Messiah. Isn't that an amazing thought? And then we read in the book of Daniel where it talks about the false Messiah, the Antichrist. He's not going to what? He's not going to have any care for the desire of women. And people think, oh, well, he's supposed to be, homosexual or something. He's not going to like women, or he's not going to like whatever. But it's got nothing to do with that, because the desire of women is to give birth to the Mashiach. And what he's really saying then, he's not going to care anything about the Messiah. In fact, the word Antichrist doesn't mean against, it means instead of. And he's the one that's going to go into the temple and set himself up and show himself to be the God. And people are going to think so for a while. But then when they find out he's really not, then it's going to be what? Run for cover. But it's going to be too late. So verse 15, the father and the mother of the young woman shall take and bring out the evidence of the young woman's virginity to the elders of the city at the gate. Boy, we went a long ways on that 1 hour, didn't we? Okay. But in verse 16, and the young woman's father shall say to the elders, I gave